Hello, and welcome to our Reimagining Long-Term Care webinar series. My name is Neil Dreimer. I work as the Director of the Health Innovation Programs at Healthcare Excellence Canada. My pronouns are he and him, and I'm so pleased to be your host for today's webinar. HEC honors the traditional territories upon which our staff and partners live, work, and play. We recognize that the standard of living that we enjoy today is the result of the stewardship and sacrifices of the original inhabitants of these territories. We must commit to not repeat past mistakes and to work towards more equitable and respectful relationships with First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Acknowledging the territories and the original stewards of these lands is a fundamental responsibility of our organization and part of our commitment to work towards truth and reconciliation. I also want to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from our office at HEC in Ottawa, which is on the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin people. We recognize and deeply appreciate their historic connection to this place and the opportunity here today, to gather here today. I invite you to share who you are and where you're joining from in the chat box on the bottom of your screen. We are pleased to offer French simultaneous interpretation for this session. If you wish to hear the voice of the interpreter, please select French from the interpretation menu at the bottom of your screen. We invite you to share your questions and comments at any point throughout the webinar in either of our official languages. If you have a comment or a question, please add it in the chat box. We will look to address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A session towards the latter portion of the webinar. We also wanted to let you know that if you need any support at any time during the webinar, you can reach out to our tech support using the chat feature. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website in the next couple of days to review and share with colleagues who may have missed it. So now it's my pleasure to welcome our speakers for today, Dr. Bonnie Lashowitz and Kara Cruz. We are so pleased to have Bonnie and Kara with us today to present the results of their research on staffing models and workforce support in long-term care through the COVID-19 pandemic, which was commissioned by HEC. Dr. Bonnie Lashowitz is a professor and graduate program director at the University of Calgary and is part of the Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies in the Cummings School of Medicine. Bonnie leads the Carer Lab as a program of qualitative and mixed methods research about responsibilities and identities in relation to an array of disability, mental health disorder, and chronic disease diagnosis. Bonnie's program is built on concepts such as resilience, busyness, and moral distress. Her projects include studies of workplace mental health with a focus on how gender and culture intersect with work and mental health. Kira has been a research assistant with the Carer Lab since 2019 and has over 3 years experience working in the long-term care settings. She completed her Bachelor of Community Rehab from the University of Calgary and graduated from the University of Toronto with a Master's of Arts in Poli-Sci. Currently, she is a policy and programs coordinator with the International Federation on Aging, where she works extensively with the WHO on their Decade of Healthy Aging portfolio. Once again, I want to extend a warm welcome to Bonnie and Kara, and just a reminder to feel free to drop any of your questions or comments into the chat box throughout the presentation. So over to you, Bonnie and Kara.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and I'm really excited to see the participants introducing themselves in the chat function. Just really struck by the variety. And I'll just start this off because I see that I have some disability studies representation in the audience. So that always excites me. Thank you, Neil, for the introduction. And Neil designated that I am a professor at U of C, and my orientation is in disability studies, and comparably with Kara's undergraduate training in disability studies. And so what that means for people who may be less familiar is that we are endlessly interested in and concerned with people who may represent themselves in less conventional ways, people who may not have articulate speech in the fashions in which we tend to organize the structures and processes of our world. So my work, as gestured towards in the introduction, is about all sorts of voices, all sorts of manifestations of personhood, representations of communicative intent and preference. And this particular stream of work, our interest in long-term care, is predicated in the principle of relational theories and definitions of autonomy, which is stated really simply, the idea that people's power, people's opportunities are created in interaction with support of others. And so, as well as being endlessly interested in people who represent themselves differently, we are parallelly interested in the supports around people. And that can be paid workforces, it can be unpaid support providers. May I have the next slide, please? So thank you for joining us in this. What we were doing, we're gonna just sort of organize our presentation in a fairly conventional fashion. This is a presentation of a research study, and so we're going to take you through the introduction and background. We're going to hit a couple of highlights about what's going on in current literatures, what is conventional sort of wisdoms that are being received, and then we're going to show you a little bit about our methods, and then we will talk through our findings. And the title of our talk today is Lessons Learned. So we do have some recommendations that we hope are meaningful to practitioners. And so the work that we did that is the genesis of this current stream of work about long-term care workforces. We were involved in a project before the pandemic struck, where we were studying people who have very advanced stages of dementia. And consistent with some of my sort of, opening remarks, we're really interested in people who might have the most difficulty being understood. And so if you go to the literature, there's a lot of studies that have been conducted with people in earlier stages of dementia. And so we were embarking upon a video study of people with late stages of dementia, who may have zero sort of spoken communication at their disposal. So that is the very much on site in the long-term care organizational setting work that we were doing. And it's not very hard to imagine that we got kicked out, so to speak, with the restrictions that came during the pandemic. We had strong relationships with people in long-term care, and it really became evident that there were a lot of exacerbated stresses and struggles through the pandemic in long-term care. And so we turned our attention to working on supporting and understanding the experiences of the paid workforce. If I might have the next slide. So I said that relational autonomy is really foundational to our understandings. And then to kind of take our work into a deeper sort of examination of workers' experiences with understandings that workers constitute the interactional environment that makes autonomy for people with limited or diminished capacities possible. We delved into this further to investigate their experiences using the concept of moral distress. And what moral distress is, for people unfamiliar with that term, is it's the experience of anguish or pain or loss because there is a rightful action that you know you would like to take, and yet the circumstances in which you're working or operating prevent you from taking that action. And so we think this is just a really meaningful way to think about these workforces, because as opposed to an individually focused kind of concept such as stress or burnout, moral distress demands that we locate the sources of the stress within the structures and processes in which people are embedded. And so what we're trying to do here, just, with this quick little visual, is get away from the idea of, the burden of responsibility for one's own mental health that can be implied or outright expressed with many of the individually focused mental health support resources that we have, which are valuable, but we're trying to move beyond the idea of, be mindful, do yoga, and, make sure that you're eating well and getting enough sleep and drinking enough water. We want to back up from there and take a bigger view and think about the layers in which individuals are embedded, and what can be done to resource those environments to be more supportive. Next slide. Another important kind of angle on all of this for us was the power of hearing lived experience stories. And so we very much wanted to hear from the long-term care workforce. And we didn't just want to hear from, the visiting geriatricians or the nursing staff. We wanted to hear from everybody. And so what we tried to do in our data is encapsulate people who work in maintenance, people who work in dietary services. We have this really fulsome interview with a hairdresser. Because it's just, it takes, that veritable village to provide long-term care support. And we really wanted to populate our data set with a diversity of experiences. And so, just really, again, trying to reach into the corners, if you will, and use the languages and experiences as stated firsthand in the words of the people who had gone through the experience. Next slide. So our purpose today, at last, is to really target staffing practices, to draw from the stories we heard, the words people spoke, and to present to you our synthesis and in-depth analysis of their ideas in terms of what can lead to better experiences for the staff. Next slide. Just to track you through some little bits and bytes from the literature, there's nothing really new here. We've known this for a long time, that this workforce is under-recognized, undervalued in so many ways. I have all sorts of opinions and investigations that I've done into that that are related to gender and culture, and I'll try to stay off of that today because that's a separate lecture, but please see me afterwards if you're interested in signing up for that. But we know things about long-term care workforces, such as that they have lower poor mental health reports. compared to the Canadian population broadly. We know that there's a lot of draw to working in long-term care, that people speak very proudly and powerfully about the satisfaction they derive from being support providers, from providing care to other people. And yet at the same time, we know that the demands of that kind of really intense, physically intense, emotionally intense labor can lead to experiences of burnout and distress. And we just always come back to the idea in all of this work that bearing in mind that the conditions of in which workers are working are equal to the conditions of the care that's being provided to people in our society. The conditions of care being provided to Canadian citizens who are in the most vulnerable circumstances. And so just a little underlining. Next slide, please, of why we think this work is so important. I'm going to hand it over to the next generation of thought leader exemplar in this whole area. Kara Cruz was instrumental in helping us to encapsulate some of our early findings and in representing those through the creation of a very short video. Kara, I'm really delighted to be talking with you today and handing this over to you now. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. So as Neil said, I've had the absolute pleasure of working as a member of Bonnie's team since 2019. So with this video, part of our study had a knowledge translation mandate. So that means instead of just publishing academic articles, that we get the information out there. And within our interviews with long-term care workers, we recognized that a lot of workers felt like no one really understood what they were going through. Sometimes they were portrayed as heroes and they were told they were inspirational, but a lot of the time the work didn't feel heroic. It didn't feel inspirational. So in order to kind of portray that, we brought together all the transcripts of our interviews and took quotes from different transcripts to tell one story of a fictional long-term care worker, but all of the words are indeed the words of long-term care workers in Canada. So if we could play the video, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
You're not just going there to do a job. Work becomes a place that feels like another home. The pandemic hit and we were thrown into a situation that would change the course of our lives. You feel like a bad guy because you're thinking, oh my gosh, what if this was me? Our residents have been with us for several years. Then all of a sudden, they were gone. I just have flashbacks to watching people die daily and quickly. We needed help, but we were supposed to be the help. My mother lives in Pakistan, but we call each other every day almost. Whenever I have a problem, she says, "No, you can do it. You know that you are very strong." We were physically fatigued, emotionally drained, and unable to grieve. The pandemic acted as a light that illuminated the cracks in the foundations of long-term care. And while that light might be fading, the cracks are still there, and we're still desperately trying to keep them from spreading.
So this was the video that we created. So as you can tell from the video, the problems existed in long-term care before the pandemic, and they continue to exist as we're in a kind of not quite post-pandemic era, but a different area of the pandemic. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be fantastic. Thank you. So the methods for this aspect of our study, it was a mixed method study. So that means we did both qualitative semi-structured interviews with 50 long-term care workers across Canada, so in the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, and Ontario. And these interviews typically lasted between 45 minutes and an hour and a half. We also released a self-administered online survey that measured worker demographics, their health outcomes, work outcomes, measured moral distress, as well as their employee assistance program, so EAP use, as well as their interest in a long-term care specific well-being and mental health app. And for that, we had, I think the most responses we had for one question was 485 responses. So together we kind of brought the themes that we noticed in the interviews with the findings of the surveyed data. And as Bonnie said, participants and respondents held a variety of roles within long-term care. So it could be anything from a COVID-19 screener, where you kind of check people in as they enter long-term care settings, all the way to top-level management. Next slide, please. So data were examined in terms of workplace experiences, mental health, staffing levels, and interactions with coworkers, and we used all of this information to generate 8 lessons learned. Next slide. So how do we come up with these lessons? It wasn't a matter of, can you tell us 8 lessons that you've learned and let us share this with the world? Instead, it was very much a process of listening and reflecting to interviews, looking at what the survey data said and how that either supported what we were seeing in the interviews or perhaps illuminated a different facet of that information. Next slide. So instead, our analysis looked much more like this. It involved discussions with workers themselves as well as within our team. Next slide, please. So 8 lessons, which I'll go through individually. But essentially, the first lesson was just talking about the importance of being on the ground as a manager, accessible, and acting as an advocate for your team, because we found this positively impacted workers' experiences. We also saw that cooperation is a source of strength, and so that really needs to be focused on supporting how other workers and cooperating together. And also making effort to include essential care partners who may not be formal employees, so family members, close friends of long-term care residents in care during crisis conditions, recognizing that this also comes with its own challenges. The fourth lesson was about recognizing workers' skills, so where they were really thriving within difficult conditions, and also the sacrifices they were making, because those sacrifices were numerous and they were significant. The fifth lesson was about communication. So we saw that it was important to communicate often and in multiple formats. So kind of creating communication as a learning opportunity rather than something that people have to be afraid of, not following the right protocols. Yeah, it's all just about learning. We also saw that peer support resources were desired and also perhaps used the most. And that resources need to be transparent and equally accessible. And finally, there just needs to be adequate resources in terms of staffing and monetary compensation, as this assisted in preventing moral distress. And I just like to note that each of these lessons, while individually they can improve an experience of working in long-term care, they come together. Like, you can't just say, oh, I'm going to do lesson 2 and lesson 8 today, and maybe next month I'll focus on a few other lessons. Like, they really support each other and reinforce each other. Next slide, please. So the first lesson, being on the ground, accessible, and advocating. So within our survey data, approximately half of respondents agreed that they were supported by upper management in their organization, while slightly more felt supported by their direct supervisors. So in-person presence was really what was equated with support. Managers who were unseen were understood by some workers to be unwilling to risk their health. It didn't always mean that managers weren't willing to risk their health. Indeed, when we spoke to some managers, they felt that by not being on the ground, they were assisting both residents and their other coworkers in being safer, because it was one less person who could potentially expose others to the COVID virus. But we really did see that other frontline workers felt like if they were the ones having to put their health at risk and their families' health at risk, that they at least wanted their managers to understand what that risk looked like. Next slide, please. So strategies used by managers to be accessible and on the ground were maintaining privacy. A lot of people had concerns about their own safety or the safety of vaccines, and they just needed someone to discuss this with. So maintaining privacy and having that trusting relationship was really significant. And that kind of ties into this idea of prioritizing workers' comfort, letting people know that they have the resources to be as safe as possible. Was also another significant aspect of having a positive workplace experience for workers. Being transparent in how decisions were made and involving workers in decisions was really desired, and we understand that it wasn't always possible. If there's a provincial mandate to change, say, visitation restrictions, you can't always have that much control of the decision as a manager, but you can explain why that decision was made and how, as a workplace, you're going to respond to it. Being vulnerable and authentic also was described by some managers as something that helped them to be closer to their workers. But it also was something that was quite difficult to do for some managers, as not showing fear or vulnerability was adopted by many managers, but the emotional cost of this was quite high. And then finally, using mistakes as learning opportunities. We all make mistakes. It was a difficult situation where there weren't always enough workers, not always enough PPE, learning new protocols. So just recognizing that people are human and they do make mistakes. So instead of penalizing them, let's all learn and grow from that mistake. Next slide, please. So cooperation being a source of strength. As anyone who is working within long-term care during the pandemic knows, there were many times where it was an all hands on deck mentality. Relationships with coworkers could be strengthened by this as everyone kind of comes together. But for some workers, they viewed this as trauma bonding, meaning that they felt like the relationship was more than they wanted out of a workplace, especially for workers who before the pandemic had very strict kind of homework boundaries. Those boundaries very quickly fell away. So that was just something to recognize, that people are suddenly in relationships that they didn't always expect or indeed want to be in. Tensions could run high, so just maintaining an atmosphere of respect and learning was really key. Next slide, please. Including essential care partners. So residents' unmet physical and emotional needs, this really impacted worker morale. So knowing that no matter how hard you work, you might not get to meet, especially the emotional needs of residents. Maybe the victory of the day is just meeting their physical needs. But a lot of workers found it quite difficult to know that they weren't fulfilling all the needs of residents. So we recommend that in future pandemic situations, training willing family members and prioritizing family member inclusion in care could reduce workload as well as improve care for residents. So a quote from one of our participants, a clinical nurse leader in BC, she said, "You already know that physically you're dying of the disease, but knowing that there's nobody there to be there for you, that would kill you more than anything." So we know that care isn't just physical, it's also emotional, and family members can really help contribute to that emotional aspect of care. Next slide, please. Recognizing workers' skills and sacrifices. 57% of our survey respondents felt that long-term care workers did not receive the same recognition as other healthcare workers. We all know, especially at the beginning, people would come out at 7 p.m. and bang their pots and pans. But workers, they kind of wanted more than that, and they wanted a recognition that for some residents of long-term care facilities, they had a relationship for 10, 20 years with this resident. So yeah, just the dynamic within long-term care is quite different from other healthcare professions, and workers wanted to just have that sacrifice and just for people to acknowledge what their experience was like. Appreciation from residents and their family members was highly valued. So kind of words of support and appreciation were valued more than something like a free t-shirt. So this could indicate that in future outbreak situations, that creating opportunities for residents and their family members to show appreciation can help both residents as well as workers. Monetary compensation was also understood to be appreciation. So instead of, working for almost minimum wage, recognizing that, your job has very quickly become your entire life during an outbreak situation, and that there should be some sort of fair compensation. On the part of management, it was understood to be quite important that they recognize and remind staff of their limits. So remind staff that you can't do everything. You don't have control over the whole situation, and you don't have control of the extent to which the virus spreads at all times. So just being very clear of what you can and cannot do as a person. So a quote from an occupational therapist in Alberta was, "So it was hard because you have your colleagues and they're also checked out and they're angry." So this was the atmosphere that people were working in while trying the best to provide care. Next slide, please. Communicating often in multiple formats. So communication needs to be very clear, needs to be written, and needs to be told in meetings, it needs to be on posters on the wall. And workers also just need time to respond to changes. We saw, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, that there would be a policy change, and then 24 hours later, there'd be another policy change, and your response to that would have to be instant. Further on in the pandemic, especially regarding visitation restrictions, we saw that a policy change would be communicated and then enacted a few days later, which was considered to be quite helpful. And then, yeah, there just needs to be an atmosphere of cooperation rather than policing, especially around auditing. Many, especially higher level workers in management positions, discussed how while audits, they understood why audits were happening of their facilities, it also took away their time to be responding to outbreak scenarios. So if audits were about providing resources to respond to those scenarios rather than policing and telling everyone all the things that they were doing wrong, that wasn't considered that helpful. Whereas again, offering support, that was what was desired. Next slide, please. Prioritizing peer support resources. Many workers, they wish to protect their family members from what they were experiencing, or if they did share what they were experiencing with family members, they could express quite a bit of frustration when family members didn't understand what it was like to work within long-term care. So workplace debriefs were desired by many workers, especially after an outbreak. There was an understanding that during an outbreak scenario, again, it's all hands on deck. You don't always have time to discuss what's going on, like in depth, or process fully just how much has happened. So after an outbreak, there was definitely a theme of people wanting to engage with the grief and also celebration of getting through an outbreak. But this didn't always happen, especially for frontline workers, such as personal support workers or HCAs. Next slide, please. Resources also have to be transparent and equally accessible. So again, with that theme of perhaps different opportunities for debriefing for frontline workers versus management level, non-management staff were not always included in access to resources such as group counseling sessions. or even hotel rooms, or if their workplace did have a policy of providing hotel rooms during an outbreak scenario, some frontline workers didn't always feel comfortable advocating for themselves to have access to that resource, even if it was a company policy. So making sure that people both know what resources they have and that they have the right to use that resource is really important. Some workers were also not aware of labor rights, such as their right to be paid overtime. So we would have participants who worked 16-hour shifts who then reported not getting any overtime pay, which was obviously quite significant. About half of our survey respondents knew that their workplace offered an employee assistance plan, while 7.3% had accessed it. The limited number of sessions available was usually a reason why people didn't feel like there was worth accessing the EAP. Typically, you'd get 4 or 5 sessions covered by your workplace, and then after that, you either could not access the EAP or you had to pay for it out of pocket. So a lot of people just felt that they had so much to say that they weren't going to benefit that much from 4 or 5 sessions. And also another kind of thing that people didn't always appreciate about EAP plans is that for some plans, you'd be speaking with a different counselor each time. So it meant that they had to reestablish a new relationship, discuss their situation, and by the time that was kind of completed, they didn't have that much time to actually discuss strategies of how to respond to the stressors they were experiencing either at their workplace or at home. Next slide, please. Finally, last lesson learned was that resources help prevent moral distress, and resources aren't always physical, but they're also just kind of ideas such as time, having the time to actually look after your own mental health. That wasn't always a resource that workers had. So almost a third of survey respondents reported working more than their scheduled hours, while most interviewees specified working through their lunch break, getting to work early, working just, an hour late sort of thing. And without additional staff, some workers felt that investment in mental health resources would be underutilized, as there wouldn't be enough time for staff to use those resources. Or if you have to work 2 jobs in order to pay your living costs, you're not going to have time to engage in mental health activities, even if they are available and covered by your company. So I'll leave you with a quote from a director of care in Alberta. So he noted that we're yes people, we're helpers, and we don't always put ourselves first. We don't, until sometimes it's too late. I've actually watched my boss burn out doing it. Sometimes just having your leadership say, hey, how are things going? You work 90 hours in 3 weeks, you're not coming in next week. So having someone take care of you without you having to ask is a remarkable feeling. So I think from these 8 lessons, we can see that it's significant to workers to feel like they're recognized, that their health is actually a priority of their workplace, and that they're encouraged to look after themselves, especially in scenarios where it's so critical that they have to look after others as well. So next slide, and I'll leave it over to Bonnie.
Thanks very much. I'm just following along the chat and just noting a comment about what courage it takes to self-disclose a need for support and how empty you can be left when that is not acted upon. And so just really appreciating, Kara, the slide with which you closed, and that idea of the magic that, people are there and looking out for and looking after you without having to ask. So thank you, that timed really nicely. And then the last thing I want to do is just put up the name of acknowledgements of our project team. And this was not the Healthcare Excellence Commission Report project team. This is our initial project team that just helped us to get this whole body of research underway. And so hopefully consistent with the kinds of messages you hear today, we are trying to rely on diverse perspectives, including family caregivers and representatives from long-term care organizations, and as well as some different research disciplinary kinds of perspectives. So we're endlessly indebted to the people that helped us get rolling and continue to provide just incredibly important advising to us. So thank you for your kind attention to all of this. And I believe we have time for some questions if anyone has.
Thanks so much, Bonnie and Kara. I mean, what important research, and really appreciate you guys sharing so much of what you learned, and also congratulations for getting so many voices to support and to be part of this research. Again, like the recognition and self-care that you just mentioned are critical. Like if we want people, these important people, to support those residents in long-term care, they need to be cared for as well. So again, I just want to thank you both for this important work. And I also was told that my camera was in a bad position before, so apologies for that if you saw a part of me that you didn't want to see, but hopefully it's adjusted now. So I did want to encourage anyone who has any questions to please type them into the chat box. And maybe I can start. I mean, lots has come to mind with what you just shared. I guess a high level question is, you spoke with and surveyed a lot of people who are working in the long-term care sector. Anything that really stands out for you is like some of that left like one of the biggest impressions on you?
I can go first, and then Bonnie, if you want to follow up. So a couple of colleagues and I on the care lab team, we noticed especially that young workers tended to respond to the situation. So young meaning that under 30, they tended to respond to the conditions of long-term care work and the moral distress that they experienced quite differently from older workers. So we've begun to explore that a little bit more in terms of what does that look like for young workers, and how can we support young workers working within long-term care, because we know that the Canadian population is aging and that we need to encourage young people to join the long-term care workforce. So we're really looking forward to diving into that more and getting that research out there.
And we've talked in various applications about trying to secure the future, for this sector. And indeed, we need to, pull out all the stops in terms of making this attractive work. And, so clearly there are some obvious sort of elements to that in the day-to-day. There's a lot of particularity, as Kara illustrated through the recommendations. There's a lot of particularity about prompt and responsive kind of, day-to-day kind of organization within long-term care. And so clearly people in long-term care work positions need to have the qualifications, they need to have the experience, they need to have the coaching and the training and the support to equip them to do this work well. And related to that, are obvious kind of tangible elements. We need these to be attractive positions that are adequately compensated. We need these to be full-time positions so that, there's, I won't tap into the single site policy that occurred at the start of the pandemic and the consequences that had for people trying to make ends meet. But we need full-time positions, we need benefits, we need higher salaries, and we've known this for a long time. We can look back to researchers who have been sounding alarm bells for decades. It continues to shock me that we say, populations are continuing to age as if we had not, been having those conversations in the 70s and 80s and 90s. So certainly there's a resource matter here. There's an organizational kind of processes and direct dynamic kinds of elements here. And then I think kind of taking that up a further level into policy and thinking about, I don't know if I'm equipped to comment about where this should be located, but thinking hard about the consequences of long-term care falling under provincial rather than national sort of jurisdiction. And I think if we had a more national level identity with all of this, we would be better equipped to treat long-term care in terms of not just the medicalized kind of elements that we've tended to traditionally associate with healthcare and healthcare workers, but to think about the social dimensions that Kara has illustrated so robustly. That care is a big thing, and healthcare is a complex big thing. That needs to be accorded the dignity and corresponding resources that accompany that. And then probably, at an even bigger ideological level, I mean, we just need to quit taking care for granted. The care in our world holds the world together. And so often this has been in the hands of poorly paid or unpaid, pronouncedly women. And I'm just, I just really want to push for ideological kinds of things that might accrue with just more messaging in some small but profound ways that care is for everybody. Care work is everybody's responsibility. It's not women's work. And I mean, we can push that agenda with basic things like stop referring to things as, moms and tots or maternity leave. We need to start this so that young people are having it entrenched that men do this work as well. And it is parental leave. And these are not moms and tots groups. These are parent and tots groups. And we just really need, because, the flip side of all of this is the way that women will be liberated from some of the constraints that are imposed on the heavy expectations on them for care work is for that work to be more broadly understood and more equitably distributed. And that means that men. So just to kind of loop that back, all of that is, blue sky thinking, I realize, but I mean, if we can create positions in long-term care that are aid positions or diet or whatever positions, rec therapy positions that attract men, the money and the recognition tend to follow where men go. I better stop.
Thanks so much for those insightful answers. And yeah, just picking up on a few things you mentioned, like language matters and creating that, the environment that really is attractive for the to support like the workers so that they can provide the care that needs to be provided. So lots to unpack. I want to encourage people to share any questions. I'm just reading a few comments that have come in, and I think I see Cynthia is talking about Cynthia St. Clair. We need better ratio of worker to resident, given how our demographics have changed over the decades. They need more of our time, no doubt about that. And reading some of the other comments here about just getting changes to wages is not a simple thing. I think we can acknowledge that for sure, but definitely we need to create those environments that attract workers again. One question I have while others are pondering is the aspect of peer support. And I know we've heard about peer support in so many different sectors in healthcare, but particularly with long-term care. Do you have any suggestions or ideas from what you've heard about what works around peer support? We know in some cases there's more formalized programs. Sometimes it's more informal. Any insights from your research on that?
Yeah, just from discussing with participants to our interviews, we thought that it occurred both in a formal manner, as you say, and also an informal manner. So we had one participant who spoke about over the summer and during of 2020, so when the pandemic was first happening, that her and her coworkers committed to going for ice cream after work once a week, socially distanced, but they would go for ice cream and they would just relax and have fun because their whole shift was responding to the pandemic. It was very emotionally tough, and just getting to spend time with people who know what's going on. You don't have to explain what your day is like while having something like ice cream. She said that it made a world of difference to her. Obviously, ice cream does not solve these big structural issues, but just even having a workplace where it encourages you to go spend time with coworkers, or bringing a resource in where, oh yeah, like we have ice cream in the fridge, let's all just go sit around together, right? While also being safe with COVID protocols. We also saw more formal strategies taken, especially for upper management, where a workplace would bring in a counselor to kind of discuss and guide the group through a session of, okay, so what have we experienced? How are we feeling? What impact has this had on our families? And just creating an atmosphere where people can share how all of this has impacted themselves. But not everyone within long-term care was included in those conversations. So it is really, I think, a balance of both. Bonnie, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
No, that's just so nicely said. And, just bearing in mind too, Kara's point from one of her slides about, being mindful that people will vary in terms of their style and their preference. And is this just one more thing to, already exhausted people? So allowing for all of that. But I would say by and large, we found, we would conclude that care workers are community-driven, kind of connection-oriented people, and indeed peer support in formal and informal ways. And what I'll just toss in is one of the ideas that I find in the literature quite frequently is Schwartz rounds. Some people on the call might certainly be acquainted with that idea, but it's an organized sort of monthly, quite often, invitation to come together at a time of the week that is not conventionally demanding in terms of hands-on duties. And each session, one or two or maybe even three people sit in chairs at the front, and they talk about something that was just incredibly difficult for them in their work in the last, since last they met. And it's just this way of putting these complicated, can't win, rock in a hard place kind of scenarios out into the open, and helping people to feel less alone, less helpless, and just creating that sense of you're among friends, and that this, what you experienced is not some bizarre extreme. It's something that's safe to talk about, and let's put it here, however difficult that might be. So that's sort of the vein in which I would recommend if we're thinking about formalized sort of peer support.
Yeah, and just something to add on, also within interviews for some workers who did attend more formal sessions provided by their workplace, there was a lot of frustration expressed when they were told to take care of themselves, make sure you're doing your yoga and your meditation. I saw someone in the comments noted something similarly. So yeah, just that importance of making sure workers don't feel like it's another task for them to have to do. That's really significant as well.
And I want to be careful too, not to paint that, these, beneficent saint-like, kind of workers, because I just am prompted to do so in seeing the question about, did you have evidence of people being unkind to each other? Kara put up the slide about you need an atmosphere of support and teaching and learning rather than policing. And oh my gosh, yes, if people felt judged or policed or tattled on, like there are all sorts of unproductive things that went on. We all would all imagine that would have been accelerated in these times of intense stress. But yeah, there's all sorts of unkindnesses that happen when people are under facing incredible demands. So not to suggest that, this is all milk and honey. If we could just, get some more money and put people together in these constructive ways, we know that personalities are really complicated entities to plan for.
Yeah, and also one strategy used in some workplaces to improve the kind of atmosphere of respect between workers was ensuring that other workers knew what each other's days looked like. So if I was a personal support worker, understanding what an occupational therapist day looks like, and likewise them understanding what my day looks like. So we just kind of see each other as people and recognize again that we're all trying to do our best here, and this is how we can kind of best work together.
And a spoiler alert, our colleague, Brittany Glowinski is on this session, and she's leading a paper that is something along the lines of suits to scrubs to tap into the canyon divide that can characterize working in different sort of areas within the same workplace, and how much lack of and sometimes it's just exactly as Kara says, putting things into a shared space so that people have a deeper empathy and appreciation for what each other are doing.
Thanks, Bonnie and Kara, and I mean that just reminds me. I'm trying to remember where I've heard about it, but a day in the life of, sometimes it's not just for the people outside of the organization or the care setting, but also within it, understanding everybody's different perspectives and what they have to manage throughout the day, I think is something that we could all benefit from. So I realize, I have lots of other questions that I could ask, but unfortunately we're out of time. So I did want to just acknowledge and once again take the time to thank both of you and everybody involved for the important research and for helping us shed light on some of the things that needs to change. I think one of the things that we like to do here at HEC is to focus on what's within our locus of control, but also to bring light to others who are listening in as to what they have an opportunity to influence. So I encourage everybody on the call who has a role to play to think about how you can impact some of the care and support that people in long-term care need to provide care. So once again, thank you both, and thank you to the audience for participating in this session today. Before we let you go, we do really appreciate your feedback to let us know if this session was helpful to you. So we ask that you please take a moment. You'll see some questions on your screen now, and just a reminder, they're all optional, but the one about gender is something that we ask, and our funder, Health Canada, also likes to collect that information. Our next webinar will be May 17th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Time, and will include a panel discussion on non-pharmacological interventions to support the appropriate use of antipsychotics within long-term care. And we'll be doing that in partnership with the BC Patient Safety Quality Council. So thank you once again, and I wish you all a great day, and take care. Thanks so much.